Well, that's great. Well, it looks like we're kind of at the top of the hour here. So if Gustavo, if you're ready, I'll go ahead and do the tee up here. And thanks for participating for sure. So welcome everybody to another Ostrom Colloquium series virtually. So thank you for participating. we're still trying this experiment out. So far, it's working, I think, fairly well, all things considered. And we're lucky here now today to be hearing from another, well, one of our own this time, leading researchers in the field. So you guys, I'm sure, know Gustavo, but I'll give a short introduction. Won't do justice, of course, to your wonderful CV, Gustavo. But Professor Torrens is now an associate professor, I believe. Is that fair to say? Almost.
Not yet.
Almost
Yet.
official. We're like 99% of the way there. Yeah.
Official.
Yeah. Professor Torrens. Research, of course, centers on political economy. He directs our political economy program at the workshop, interested in institutions, how they influence economic outcomes, but also the determinants of institutions, institutional change, property rights. And of course, his work has been widely published, Journal of International Economics, Games and Economic Behavior, Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, etc. Today, Gustavo will be talking a little bit about his recent work entitled Hidden Drivers of Violence Diffusion, Evidence from Illegal Oil Siphoning in Mexico, which I found actually to be really interesting. So thank you again, Gustavo, for leading the discussion here today. So the floor is yours. I look forward to a great discussion. Oh, and just like last time, guys, if you would like to either you can, when we get there, you can either raise your hand, put your question in the chat box, or just message me directly, whatever you prefer, and we'll make sure you get on the queue. Okay, Gustavo, it's all yours. Thank you for being here.
Okay, Scott, thank you very much for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to present in the Ostrom workshop. So let me go full screen. Okay, there we go. So so this is a joint project with Ivan Lopez Cruz, so now in Sabanji University, but a graduate from our PhD program in the Econ department. And also he was really involved with the Ostrom workshop while he was in IU. So let me start motivating a little bit what kind of questions we are interested in this research agenda, and in particular this project. So we've been thinking about the spatial diffusion of criminal activities, but also of violence, okay? So the type of question that we want to answer is, imagine that authorities increase law enforcement's efforts in some locations for specific activities, for example, drug trafficking. What will happen with criminals? Of course, they will relocate to other places, but are they going also to change their activities? So are they going to rebalance their portfolio of illegal activities? Once a crime is displaced to other locations, what will happen with violence? So violence will be also displaced or not, okay? So we think that this is in general interesting for the economics of crime, but it's particularly interesting if we have to deal with criminal organizations, because criminal organizations, they have more capacity to mobilize resources to switch from one location to the other, and potentially also to diversify their portfolio of illegal activities to other activities. So they have the resources and the ability to do that. And from the policy perspective, if you really want to start developing some way of intervention, so essentially how you deploy law enforcement resources, well, you better have an idea of what will happen in terms of displacements of crime and violence before you intervene. One possible way is essentially how you cover your bases. So which locations and which activities you should be checking if you are going to intervene in some locations and in some activities. So, well, that's kind of the big picture of what is this research agenda about. And the Mexican war on drugs, essentially, I think it's terribly nasty for Mexican citizens, but at the same time provide a large-scale laboratory study to study violence and crime, okay? So let me give you a little bit of background of what is the Mexican war on drugs. So in 2007, Felipe Calderón, the newly elected Mexican president, launched a war on drugs We can discuss a lot about the reasons, but in some sense, the reasons are not super important for this paper. It's important to know what is the Mexican War on Drugs. Essentially, it's a series of military operations in some municipalities, and the objective is to arrest or eliminate drug lords commanding these important drug trafficking organizations. And I'm going to show you pictures in a second, but before the Mexican War of Drugs, you see there was a downward trend in violence in Mexico. No huge decrease in violence, but some downward trend. And on top of that, violence was highly concentrated in a handful of traditionally problematic areas. After the Mexican War on Drugs, there was a huge and dramatic increase in violence, and also violence spread to other areas that previously were relatively peaceful. Okay? So our hypothesis is essentially that what happened is that the Mexican War on Drugs produced more conflict among drug trafficking organizations. This produced an increase in the cost of drug trafficking, and this leads to criminal diversification, and in particular, many cartels are starting to steal oil from the Mexican oil pipeline networks. And this was what generated violence in oil-abundant municipalities. So this is kind of the basic idea of what is our driving hypothesis here. So let me show you a little bit of data and pictures. So this first figure shows annual homicide rates over time. As you see, before the Mexican War on Drugs, this dotted line in 2007, that marks the beginning of the Mexican War on Drugs. So we split here the sample between municipalities that are in a drug valuable region and municipalities that are not in a drug valuable region. And you can do that in different ways. It doesn't really matter how you do it. The picture is always the same. So downward trend in homicide rates before the Mexican War on Drugs, and this huge spike on violence after the Mexican War on Drugs. What about the Mexican War on Drugs and oil theft? So what happened with this second activity that we are considering? Well, here what you observe is a number of detected taps in the oil pipeline networks. This is an oil pipeline network that goes over different places in Mexico. It's run by Pemex, the state oil Mexican company. And as you see, there are not much movement in the number of detected taps before the Mexican War on Drugs, but huge increase in the number of detected taps, illegal taps in the network. Okay, so just a technical note here: the way they detect the illegal taps is through a reduction in the pressure of the pipelines. So eventually, all the taps are detected, but it's not clear that after you detect it, it's easy to go and stop the people using that tap to extract oil. So you need to send the army, the police. It's a really complicated process. But one thing that we know for sure is that eventually every tap is detected. Okay? So hopefully you can see a map of the Mexican territory. Here is, I'm just plotting the municipalities across the pipeline network, and those circles in gray mark the homicide rates before the beginning of the Mexican War on Drugs. And this is exactly the same map, but with homicide rates after the beginning of the Mexican War on Drugs. So there was an increase in the level of violence along the pipeline net. Okay, so what we did in these papers are essentially two things. First, we developed a simple model. The key idea is essentially just to guide and put some order in our mind, and also to give some order to the empirical analysis. And then the key part of the paper is the empirical part. So I'm not going over the details of the model. I have just 2 slides describing the basic idea of how the model works, okay? So imagine that you have 2 activities, drug trafficking and oil, D and O there in the picture. Initially, each cartel is operating in one of these squares that essentially represent the location. And essentially each cartel, it's pretty safe in its location, okay? So essentially there are not much disputed profits coming from drug trafficking. Each cartel essentially is running an illegal activity in one location, and there is not much fighting over the routes or the resources, because essentially each cartel is working in its own area of operation, essentially. In that circumstance, most cartels are essentially specialized and they're sending all their capital to drug trafficking, and then oil theft is something that they don't care about, essentially. There is some oil theft going on, but it's essentially not run by the cartels, okay? So this happened when the probability, so the proportion of the profits that each cartel has protected, essentially non-disputable, are relatively high, and as a consequence, the profits that are disputable, or the routes or the resources that are disputable, are relatively small. What happened after the government intervention is what you observe in this second slide. So essentially, you attack one cartel, these cartels, it's weakened in some area, and then suddenly there are routes, resources, or in general, profits that becomes disputable. As a consequence, cartels invest more in guns, thus produce violence in the drug region, but now also drug trafficking becomes, like, in unexpected terms, less profitable, and that pushed some cartels to start investing in oil extraction. Some of those revenues or profits from oil extraction are also disputable, so cartels start investing also in guns or generating violence related with oil, and then there you get this yellow spot on the oil column that now it's activated, so you have cartels entering into that business. There is also disputable resources, all cartels investing to get some of those disputable profits, and then essentially this is a situation in which cartels are diversified and violence spread to the oil region, and this could be a region with no strategic value for drugs. So the empirical part of the paper, essentially we have data, or everything's at the municipality level. We have almost 2,500 municipalities from 2000 and 2016. We have homicide rates. We have some socioeconomic characteristics at the municipality level. Unfortunately, we don't have GDP or income per capita at the municipality level, so we need to use proxies for level of development. There are some proxies available, so we use those. And then we get some geographic information, including the location of the pipeline networks, the location of the illegal taps, the locations of important processing plants for hydrocarbons. And what is really important, we use several different ways of defining the drug valuable region. The main one is coming from a paper written by Osorio, 2015, which essentially uses drug scissors, but there are many other ways of capturing what is a spot that is valuable for drug trafficking, and the results essentially persist. So summary of the results. The presence of oil pipelines is associated with an increase in homicide rates, between 4 to 6 additional homicides rate per 100,000 inhabitants. 4 to 6 depends on which type of specification or what type of econometric model you have in mind, and we check different alternatives that I'll be happy to discuss with you later. Another important result is that the oil-related violence is not evenly distributed across the pipeline network. Essentially, there are isolated branches, and there are more dense branches of the network most of the violence is going on in these isolated branches, in which in our leading specification, we are getting 11 additional homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. And in those dense branches of the networks, you only get 2 additional homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. The other thing, the other important result that we found is that so drug-related violence is quite infectious, in the sense that if you're a neighbor to a place that get drug violence, you are there's high probability that you also get violence. With oil-related violence, the same happens. So there are huge and relatively large spillover effects from violence generated through oil conflict. Okay, so I will skip this so we have some more specific discussion of the identification strategy. And let me briefly wrap up in my, last 2 or 3 minutes, some related literature, and then also the conclusions. So there are some few papers on criminal diversification, and some evidence that goes from anecdotal evidence, from more empirical papers that show that drug trafficking organizations, under the proper circumstances, they start doing other things, for example, extortion, kidnapping. So this is not the first paper I try to think about criminal diversification in the context of drug trafficking organizations, but I think I don't know of any paper that deals with illegal extraction of natural resources and criminal diversification in that direction. We would also like to connect this paper with a huge literature on hotspot policing. So the whole idea here is that if you attack those hot, violent, or criminal spots, then this is really good. So you tend to reduce crime, and then sometimes you even find positive spillover to other areas. In some sense, what we are saying is, hey, careful that maybe those results do not apply when you are dealing with criminal organizations, because criminal organizations, they are much more capable of switching locations and also switching activities. And finally, we can also relate our results with the natural resource curves, because here is essentially because you have oil, you are getting some essentially conflict issues, but again, it's only related to that, okay? So we are not claiming anything about the validity or not of the natural resource curves in general. We're just saying it's a positive correlation between, so there is a causal relation between having oil and getting more violence, but that's it. So conclusions. So it's if you attempt to dismantle organized crime, we should seriously consider the possibility of crime diversification, and also of geographic distribution of crime and violence. In the case of Mexico, this seems to be really, really important. And it seems to be very important to the activity where the criminals decide to relocate, what is the level of protection that the government can provide in those activities. And finally, policy implication. In some sense, we are still working on that. But our idea is that this paper is suggesting that if you can cover your bases, it's a good idea to go and attack criminal organizations, because then it's going to be very difficult for these organizations to relocate to another interesting activity in which they can generate violence. So in some sense, you get benign displacement, no? But if you're going to do it gradually or only in some locations, be careful, because you can generate a wave of crime, a wave of violence and conflict. So essentially intervention, it has these unintended consequences. Okay, so I didn't have time to go over a lot about the identification strategy, but I'm sure that when you ask questions, that will give me the opportunity to talk about more what is our approach to identify the effect of oil on violence, essentially.
Absolutely fascinating. Well done, Gustavo. Thank you so much. How about first we'll do a round of applause, even virtually. We'll do another one at the end, but that was great. So the first person who contacted me was Jess. So if you'd like to go first, Jess, that would be great. And then, yep, okay, Alex, will get you on the queue. And like I said, feel free to put your hand up or message me, and we'll get you on the queue next too.
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Sure can,
Okay,
Jess. Yeah,
great.
perfect.
Just making sure.
Yeah.
So Gustavo, I found this paper incredibly fascinating. As someone who has done some kinds of similar work on sort of location of conflict and resources, I found it really, really fascinating. My first question is about maybe this is not a super interesting question, but I'm curious how homicides actually happen in these oil regions, right? So especially in an isolated network, like where the highest increase was, which were isolated lines, right? What exactly is the nature of the homicides that happen? And I ask this in part because most models of this type that I've seen impose a sort of rents cost on conflict. So like, for instance, conflict that occurs near the pipeline destroys some portion of rents that the group would get from that pipeline. And so the question is, either it's a kind of conflict that has those costs, at which point it'd be interesting to maybe include them in the model, or it's a kind that doesn't have those kinds of costs, and therefore it's sort of, would it just be sort of the drug cartels targeting an individual person at the actual tapping point? And if that's the case, is that seems like a different kind of violence than you'd see in drug trafficking reasons, where sort of, for instance, you might have competition over territory, you might have competition over labor for extracting that, which you don't really have so much at the tapping point of oil. So I'm sort of interested in how those things, how the types of homicides that occur and violence that occurs differ in each of the kinds of illegal activities that they're interested in, and if there's some rents cost or rents dissipation as a result of that. And then my second question was just a small thing about why there's no portion of protected rents. There's no P for oil siphoning, but there is for drug running. And then my final one, which is more generalized question, had to do with, so this is super fascinating about a kind of really impressively run kind of organization, and particularly a crime organization. So in terms of thinking about, you talked a little bit about the natural resource curse, and that's always about sort of formal insurgency groups. And so my question is are there sort of clear differences between how these groups are likely to operate in this kind of context? Or could we expect that opportunistic insurgencies, separatist movements might behave kind of similarly and might have similar kinds of policy ramifications?
Okay, so Scott, should I go and answer Jess' questions?
No, please feel free if you wouldn't mind. Yep. And then I will, I'll go down in the order that they were received, unless anybody has a two finger.
Okay, so Jessica, thank you very much. Those are fascinating questions. Let me see what I can do here. So first of all, related to what kind of homicides or violence you get in different places, it's we have some characteristics of the victims, and with that maybe we can do something else. That's one thing that we haven't done, but I think we have some data available to check a little bit more. What we did in the paper in one of the robustness checks is that we consider what we call imported homicides, meaning people that resides in different municipalities, but they were a victim of a homicide in a oil municipality, for example. And what we try to capture with that is the idea, essentially, these are conflict between drug trafficking organizations to control some specific location. So essentially what they do is that they send essentially hitmen, soldiers, whatever, just to fight and gain control of an activity. So in that case, the people that end up dying, they are essentially non-residents from those municipalities. And if you buy that story, that again, you may or not, there is also evidence that essentially having oil increases the imported homicides that you get, okay? So it's something I think goes in the direction that you are mentioning. Regarding the rents in the model, we don't emphasize a lot and we don't get a lot of results in terms of rent because kind of the whole point is trying to get more comparative static with respect to homicides because it's our dependent variable in the empirical analysis. But in the model, definitely there is rent dissipation because there's investment in guns and in conflict, with essentially in these models of conflict that generates, it works as a rent dissipation. When there is, what we are not considering in the model is that you destroy part of the resource with the conflict. I think that's doable. I think it's an extension that we can do, but it's definitely not in the paper yet. Third, connected with this idea of why there is a fraction of the profits protected in oil, so protected in drug but not in oil. So there is something in the version that you read of the paper, there is some part of the oil business that is fully protected and some part that is not protected. But again, we discover now in a more general version of the model that we don't need that. So essentially we can model the drug trafficking sector and the oil sector pretty much in the same way, and then the results persist. So sorry, that's not the version that you read of the paper. We are working on several changes, and one of the changes is essentially a more coherent model that models drug trafficking and oil stealing in a more symmetric way, and still the basic results persist. So I see the point. With that model, I would be worried about that point. Now that we develop this more general model, I'm less concerned about that point. And then your final, remind me your final point. It's about.
Yeah, it was just about the sort of organizational capacity of the group and whether it's this is really unique to particularly large crime syndicates like drug cartels, or whether the same kinds of dynamics we should expect to see in maybe separatist insurgencies that have similar kinds of resources and capacities.
So there is a lot of anecdotal journalist evidence that the cartels really got involved in this process. I'm sure that initially they were not. Stealing oil was not their main activity. So essentially, they entered into this after the Mexican War on Drugs. There were some cartels that entered. They were kind of first comers. They were late comers. The conflict came to some extent a little bit later. The violence and the way they were operating with between drug trafficking and oil theft was very different. In part because the production function is different. So drug trafficking, in some sense, requires a lot of facilities. So it's more capital intensive. Stealing oil turns out to be, believe me, I was surprised that it's very labor intensive. You need a lot of people that go and check and protect the spot and be there checking, blah, blah, stop the authorities when they try to come and review the pipeline. So essentially, the drug trafficking organization in some places, they pretty much move more to a model of a rebel group trying to co-opt some local communities, give some kind of jobs to the people in those small communities, and then start operating the oil theft business, and then they manage in a more kind of large scale professional level how they redistribute this to in the gasoline black market essentially. So we are thinking to do something in that direction. So far, this is what I can tell you, not much at the empirical level, but we are considering doing something more about, well, the way they organize is different in one activity versus the other. Again, our feeling is yes, but we don't have like hardcore empirical evidence, more like anecdotal evidence of that.
And I just to add on, that is super fascinating and would be helpful to even have in this paper, just to recognize that like there is significant like labor required to engage in this activity. Because I initially assumed it was like one guy typing the like they got this information from Pemex, they just go and then they're like they just need one guy who's willing to do it. But like that's super fascinating. Is really helpful. So thanks.
Yes, Jessica, that was it. That was exactly my idea. And then Iman, Ivan really knows much better all the details of the data, more historical things on what was going on in Mexico. Told me, hey, no, be careful. It turns out that goes in the opposite direction, most likely.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
That was great, Jess. Yeah, and I know you have to run too, so I'm glad you got to get that in. Thanks for participating. And it looks like I have Michael next, and then I'll put the rest of the queue that I have up here just in the chat box so you guys all have it. But please feel free to keep adding to it. We should have time.
Yes, I have a couple of minor questions and a minor comment. The first question is, I was really surprised by the numbers that you got, that in the direct municipalities near the pipelines, it was only like increase in 3 homicides per 100,000, and in the neighbors it was like 8 or something.
Yep.
So how do you explain this? I mean, it's really baffling. So I would have expected it to be with the opposite. The other very minor question is, it was really fascinating explanation about the oil typing business. I didn't know how it's done either, and I'm just interested. So do they like have, like, you know, illegal refineries also? Because oil, like, you know, you have to refine it in order to make it useful. Well, so in a minor comment is, I looked briefly at that Pinotti paper you cited. I did not know about it before, and I thought it was extremely weak on empirical. I mean, it's an empirical paper, and it's extremely weak empirical paper. So, I mean, you could cite it, of course, because all you really are interested, I guess, is correlation. But it is just, well, it's extremely weak. I can explain it to you if you're interested at some other point. What the problem, so in that particular regression where they regress organized crime on natural resources and stuff, it's just, it has 2 big problems. So that's one regression.
Okay. Scott, should I go?
Oh, no, feel free to, Gustavo. Yeah, that's fine.
Michael, thank you very much. Those are very, very good questions. So it's we are also surprised about the direct versus indirect effects. So we've been thinking what to do. Ivan, it's right now working exactly on that because we don't have, unfortunately, any clear explanation besides this idea that it seems that oil-related violence is quite contagious, but I'm also extremely surprised that the indirect effect is bigger than the direct effect. So we tried very different specifications, several changes to the spatial regression model. We are always getting this. So I think at this point we really need to start thinking about explanations, rather than thinking that there is something wrong going on with our econometric, which was kind of our initial idea. Okay. So any comments or suggestions of what we should do, extremely welcome, because it's one of the issues that we've been struggling with. Okay. Your second point is a really fascinating point. Part of the tips that they get from Pemex employees that they bribe is what kind of product they are moving through the pipelines, and essentially they only go and extract when they are moving gasoline or something that you can easily sell in the black market.
I see. It is the pipeline that moves refined oil and not crude oil.
Exactly. Well, I think sometimes they use, I don't know exactly all the engineering details, but my feeling is that you can use the same pipelines for different products, and Pemex have been adjusting a little bit, and then it's trying to send more of the things that cannot be, so that you need to refine. But still, the basic purpose of the national pipeline network is to send gasolines to cities through Mexico, so they cannot avoid sending gasolines.
Sure.
Then they receive these tips from the Pemex employee that they bribe, and then boom, they only go. So essentially, the tap is open once. So these are underground pipelines, no? But then they go and reopen the tap when they are sending gasoline or something that they can sell in a black market. And then I think what they do is they go and resell it to a gas station. There is some anecdotal evidence that cartels also started doing a little bit of vertical integration, and they started operating gas stations too.
All right, just a point of clarification. So if they can plug the hole, then how would the tap be discovered later?
Oh, because it's like, so Pemex implemented a system that captured the level of pressure in the pipeline, okay? And that essentially, when you open the tap for the first time, that produces a temporary reduction in pressure. And so essentially Pemex received that information.
You know it already from the first time it's opened. Okay, yeah.
Yes, exactly. So then what I understand is that then well, it's a whole thing is to do it for the first time, you really need very good maps of where are the pipelines, because they're underground. Again, they get it also from Pemex, bribing the right people. In some cases, they even kidnap engineers from Pemex. So honest people that they are kidnapped, they are forced to open the illegal tap. And then after that, they know the location of that illegal tap, and they reopen it when they want to extract gasoline, essentially.
Okay.
And then they use a lot of people, local community, blah blah, to protect that spot, to give you alerts when the authorities are reviewing, or when the authorities comes and close it, just to come back next week and reopen the same spot or a new spot close by, essentially.
Okay.
And then I would be super happy to talk with you about the other paper that you are mentioning about organized crime and natural resources. Yes, my feeling is that there is nothing as good as this paper, but we wanted to be, humble and cite all the related literature. But yes, Ivan has been telling me several times, hey, Gustavo, some of these papers are very weak, and I was pushing him in the opposite. Well, we should cite anyway.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
So it's yes.
We're on the side of being inclusive.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. No, and that was great. Great.
Michael, fascinating questions.
Yeah. And it looks like we have Angie next, and then Mike McGinnis.
I just have one quick comment. I wonder if it makes a difference at all that in my mind, there's a difference between the approaches and policies on the way the military behaves versus the way, a standard police department behaves. And I don't know it does, but I think that needs to be in here right up front, is that, Mexico, I don't know what Mexico does, but if Mexico frequently deploys the military to respond in a police type manner, I wonder, what different policies govern the way they behave. And there is definitely research out there that supports the idea that if you behave in a more aggressive manner, you foster more aggressive responses and more aggressive posturing long term. And so, I sort of assume that matters, but if your argument is it doesn't, or that the military isn't in effect the police in Mexico, that has to be right up front, in my opinion.
Good. So that's a very good question. It's a difficult one to answer, Angie, too. So it's a couple of ideas that most likely look like a partial answer. It's I think that the national authorities, they have this idea that local police forces were highly captured by the cartels, specifically in those areas in which the strongholds of the cartels. So in some sense, it's like reinforcing the local police. It's not going to work a lot. There are some papers that have been exploiting some of this idea. It's like there are some programs that send more arms and more resources to local police, and it seems that those interventions were they have very negative effects. So essentially, you just give more powerful arms to one cartel, the one that was able to capture the local police, and then essentially there is no you're just putting more gasoline in the conflict fire in that location. At some point, I think the Mexican authorities were kind of forced to deploy something beyond police forces. Let me give you a very extreme example. At some point, the cartels stole an helipad from an oil platform in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. So they have to send the Navy to protect some of the platforms. So it's so essentially the level of organizations and the resources that these organizations have, it's in some sense goes beyond what I believe local police forces can do. At the same time, these interventions that try to make local police stronger seems to be highly ineffective. Now what we are seeing in this paper is that more centralized interventions they also have a lot of problems. So I think what this requires is a much more careful thinking of how to plan a good intervention. It's not easy to figure out what is the right approach. And in some sense, that's why way of reading our paper. Hey, here you have to be more careful how you develop your intervention. If you don't want to generate a wave of violence that even spread to places that were originally pretty peaceful, no? And again, my feeling is that this is kind of a partial answer, but that's all I have so far.
That was great. Thank you. Thanks, Angie. And Mike McGinnis, if you're on, you're welcome to go next.
Hey, thanks, Scott. Gustavo, this is a very impressive paper. You've got a lot of robustness checks that any reviewer is going to have to dig through in some detail, and I didn't do that. But I do have a specific kind of question. I was a little concerned about how you measured the relative importance of a location for the drug cartels or the organized crime organization, whichever they're doing. It seemed to me you mixed up measures of their geographic location and kind of a behavioral sort of aspect. You had, for example, for the drug companies, the drug location sites importance, they could be close to the coast, or they could be a place where there's been a lot of drugs that have been seized. And I think you had a similar thing for the oil. They're close to the pipeline, or they're close or far away from the pipeline, or something like that. Or I think there was something about how much oil was recovered, or something in different approaches. It seems to me that those behavioral aspects are a little better modeled as an aspect of what the government is doing in response to these situations, and that an increased seizure of drugs would seem to make a site not more important in terms of benefits, but more costly in terms of the potential conflict that you're entering in with the military or the police or the Navy or whoever. And so it seemed to me that those two aspects, the geographical and the behavioral, might be treated separately or differently in your measure of how important these are, because the one deals with the potential benefits and the other deals more with the costs. And how is that going to affect, if if what I'm saying has some consequence, how does that affect how you evaluate the consequences of governmental policies as a response to this, and what, you know, a lot of your analysis deals with how they shift. You get these unintended consequences from the behavior, and so how would that affect any policy analysis? So just thought I'd raise that, and I'm curious to see what you have to say on that.
Cool, Mike. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting question, and in some sense, it goes to the core of some tension that you see in the paper. Let me tell you what is that tension. For the empirical analysis, what we need is the following thing. We want to avoid the confounding factor that a municipality is getting some violence because of drug or because being close to drug violence, okay? And then that you are confounding that with with violence associated with having oil, no? So in order to do that, it's very important in our identification strategy to identify places that essentially they do not have drugs or they are not important for drugs, okay? So that they have zero value for drug trafficking, okay? And then there are many ways of doing that, okay? A more geographic approach will say, well, you need to enter the product from, I don't know, some place in South America, and then you need to move it to the US. That's the core of the business, okay? Under that definition, then you want to include the coastal lines, the frontier, the northern frontier, and the southern frontier of Mexico. More a geographic approach. A different approach would be, okay, so every place that in the past you have been getting some drug seizures, and then if you go and see that distribution, those places are highly concentrated in some locations. So we take like the top 20% of that distribution. If you are those municipalities, then I would consider you valuable for drug trafficking. Another approach is focusing on the transportation network. So you include municipalities that are close or they have airports, key facilities, roads, highways, all that approach, okay? And then another approach is essentially to combine these things. So what we did is in the core of the paper is a combination between the CSART approach and the geographic approach. And then in the robustness section, we check different definitions, and again, we always get the same result. So and what is this main result? Is that you are getting violence in places that, however you define the drug valuable region, you're getting violence in places that are not valued for drug trafficking, okay? So that's one thing. So the empirical analysis pushes you in that direction, no? And then something similar going on with oil. Or you want to identify the places that have oil, and then we have this idea that places that are close to refinement facilities, two things are going on there. It's more difficult to attack the pipelines there, and on top of that, the authorities tend to so they are highly protected, those facilities, and the pipelines close to those facilities. So violence does not increase a lot in those areas, increase more in the isolated branches of the networks, where in those places are not highly protected, okay? But then if you want to understand from the theoretical point of view, so essentially, maybe you want to do something else. And in particular, maybe what you want to do is start thinking a little bit more of what is the political economy of the intervention, okay? What is the government thinking at the point of the intervention? How they are going to be reacting once they start seeing some results? And then what is going on is sometimes what you want to do theoretically doesn't perfectly overlap with what you want for the empirical identification. And in some sense, the tension is not fully resolved in the paper, but in some sense, I think that this paper is more empirical than theoretical. So we ended up with a paper that's essentially serving the empirical part. So that's why it's kind of a minimal model that isolates from many interesting political economy issues, behavior of the government, so on and so forth, and focus a lot on how a government intervention affects violence in different areas, because that's what better serve the empirical part of the paper. But totally agree that once you write the model, you are huge temptation to start playing around in different directions. So yeah, I don't know. That's where the paper is right now. So I think there is a possibility of pushing more for trying to understand more the behavioral component of the government from a positive perspective, how they are behaving, the way they are behaving, okay? But at the same time, we have much less information empirically about that.
Mhm.
So we ended up kind of bypassing that with a model that focused on what we have data to play with, essentially, no?
Okay, thanks. That was a good answer.
No, it sure was.
Thank you, Mike.
And just in the interest of time, we might do a little bit of a lightning round, Gustavo. So I might just ask if Jillian, Dean, and Brian, maybe you could all put your questions out there, and then whatever you'd like to or have time to respond to, Gustavo, you're welcome to. So maybe Jillian, would you like to go first?
Yes. Hi, Gustavo. Thank you very much for a really, really interesting paper. I have two simple questions. The first one is, so many drug cartels or criminal organizations in Mexico, at least from that I know, is that they often create their distinctive crime marks so to warn off their competitors. So I would imagine that in sight of oil siphoning, local residents will be able to report or identify which drug cartels is or which criminal organizations, or even evidence from the ground, you know, because of these distinctive marks they make to identify which group they belong. We'll be able to tell the connection between drug cartels activities and oil siphoning. So it seems to me that your research comes a little bit of this a presumption, or that at least you see it true, that it's insufficient to tell the connections between the two from local evidences and local residents reporting. So if you could explain a little bit about that, that'd be great. And then the second thing is, so you used the word diversification. So I was also thinking of these other crimes that I often read, which is like, you know, blackmailing local residents or farmers or businesses for protection fees. And then also in some cases, local drug cartels will force local farmers or local business to produce the products they think are more lucrative in order to make up the loss from the drug crackdown. So I wonder why you choose oil siphoning as the marking diversification over other types of crime. Thank you.
Good question. And then just to get them all out there, or both questions rather, Jillian, let's have Dean and Brian, if you're both still on the line.
Yeah, hi Gustavo. So a couple of quick things, some of them have been hit by others. You know, the model is pretty precise, I think, about intervention leading to guns, leading to homicides, but what's missing for me, and you've got this aggregate data at the municipality level, what's missing for me is, why is it oil? Why are we killing more people? What's the payoff to that? Why do they respond by killing more when the police crack down rather than why aren't they going out of business? I mean, there's some things that are just kind of missing for me there, and maybe you get at them in more detail in the paper. But is there let's put it another way: is there an alternative theory that would be consistent with this? One thing that jumps to my mind is what happened to the price of oil during this period. There are other revenue sources that these guys could have gone into, and finally, did the government react by changing policy when it when it leads to some local eruptions, for example? So those are just a few kind of big general ideas.
Great. Thanks a lot, Dean. And then Brian, if you'd like to offer your comment.
In a sense, this connects with the other two questions in terms of thinking about other crimes and government reactions. What are the policy implications if government wants to change priorities, for example, and decides it's much more concerned about controlling kidnapping? Thank you.
No, thank you, Brian. And so you have like 3.5 minutes, Gustavo. So, you should feel free to pick any of those that you'd like to respond to, and I'm sure we'd be happy to continue the conversation later on.
Thank you very much for the three of you. Those are very good questions. So I think I will attack one question that I think the three of you are asking me about. So why oil? What are the alternatives here? So the beginning is a little bit of anecdotal evidence. At some point, there were some accidents in Mexico, so it's a very risky business tapping the oil pipeline networks. So somehow, sometimes this generates fires. So this started getting some attention. So essentially, people started wondering about what is going on with that. At the same time, Pemex started being really worried about the level of extraction going on in the network. So it started being like a serious national problem. Okay, so again, it's difficult to really quantify this. There are some back of the envelope calculations. So some organizations, at some point we found some estimations that 20% of the gasoline sold in Mexico was channeled through this black market. I found that too high, but still it was a relatively serious estimation. So oil was kind of focal in some sense as the second next activity, to the point that some major cartels at some point it was more important the oil business than drug trafficking. There are interviews with former cartel leaders. Again, you can believe or not those interviews, that essentially they explicitly say that until some point in time before the Mexican war on drugs was our main activity. Then after that, what happened is that it was really too risky, the business, and then we, at the beginning, temporary switch, but then we found a good spot and we stay on tapping the oil network. So there is a lot of anecdotal evidence that push in the direction of seeing oil. It's perfectly possible in the model to add other things. In this more general version that I mentioned to Jessica, we are adding a third activity. So the third activity is kind of a benign displacement of crime. So it's a criminal activity still with some rent dissipation, but not violence. And then we are modeling a little bit more about when you move to, so when you go from drug trafficking to this third activity and when you go to oil. So, and again, under some circumstances in more general model, you get what I think the Goren was looking for, is that you move from drug trafficking to, well, you're going out of business essentially. What I think Dean was suggesting, or going to minor criminal activities. And under some other levels of the parameters, then you move to start extracting oil. So I think this more general model will be able to tell us a little bit more about when you go in that one direction, when you go in another direction. Something that we're exploring in terms of mechanisms there is that maybe there is a little bit of a fixed cost of entering in some activities, and especially in oil. So you cannot do it at a very small scale level, while maybe extortion or kidnapping can be done at a much smaller scale. Drug trafficking requires some scale. Maybe you need to pay some fixed costs. So it's possible that for some drug cartels that they have they don't have easy access to the pipelines. Then for them, it's essentially too costly to enter into oil business, to the oil business. So in that cases, you get what the government was expecting, like benign displacement to this third activity that it's not as violent as the other one. Again, but that's very preliminary. Finally, I will mention just briefly two things. Price of oil. There were a lot of changes in price of oil in this period. We are adding some robustness checks in which we include the price of oil. Nothing really important is changing in terms of results. So the results are robust to the price of oil, but we are thinking how to exploit the price of oil a little bit more, given that there were some important changes in the price of oil. So maybe we can interact the changes in the price of oil with the Mexican war on drugs and the availability of oil in the municipality to get some kind of more heterogeneous effects of oil, or a different temporal effects of oil. And then in terms of effects on local communities, I think this is highly connected with Jessica's question. Yes, it seems that the type of local engagement with the community that you have with oil is very different than the ones that you have with drugs. It requires much more involvement with these local communities, and there are a lot of cases in which the communities are stopping the army when the army comes to close those taps that the drug cartels have started. So in some sense, I think it's a very interesting idea what Jessica was suggesting. In these areas, the cartels are behaving closer to rebel groups in some sense, but we don't have any empirical evidence on mafia-type behavior, asking for bribes or extortion. Unfortunately, we don't have data on that. For another activity, something, if we want to go on the empirical side, I think we have data on car thefts, so we can add that into the analysis, and we can bring that to the analysis as a third activity. Maybe the cartels switch to that. Again, that's something that I don't have the results, but it's something that we can do. So yeah, I'm not answering all the questions, but I think we are running out of time. Thank you very much. Those were wonderful comments. I have many pages here written with comments. I will just put everything in a file after we finish the conversation, but they definitely will be extremely useful in this process that we are going through, reviewing and changing the paper to make it a better paper, I think.
Excellent. Well, I'm so glad. In all your free time, you can implement those. And thanks again to all the participants. Thank you, Gustavo. Another virtual round of applause, and otherwise, yes, for participating. That was excellent. And sorry for running over just a few minutes, but I thought the discussion was great. Just as a reminder, everybody, we have Tessa in our last scheduled so far research series of the semester this Wednesday at noon. And thanks to Gustavo for moderating that event. I unfortunately have a conflict for that one.
Super welcome. It's a pleasure.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. And then next Monday, we have David Stadelman for one final colloquium, at least so far, though we can maybe populate one more if the opportunity arises. And remember as well that we do also have the Cyber Peace Colloquium online this Friday morning and the following Friday morning with a lot of different affiliates, including Jess Steinberg presenting in that. So we'll be sending out more information about that later in the week. But hey, in the meantime, I hope all of you are well, be safe. Let us know any exciting events or news that we can help to spread the word about. And I look forward to seeing you guys very soon, if not Wednesday, then definitely the next Monday, if not before. So thanks again. Thanks again, Gustavo. That was great. And have a great day, everybody.
Thank you very much,
all right, excellent. Thanks again. Take care. Bye.
And we're done.
Okay.
See you, Gustavo.
Thank you, David. So,
all right.
good.
Yeah.